Candace held on tight as Tommy drove them across town. The buildings that passed by looked like a blur to her. Whatever she'd puked up onto Jen in the cafeteria helped her to feel a little less nauseous, and she was thankful for that as they bounced up and down on Tommy's motorcycle. They crossed over a concrete bridge that led them to a part of town known as the Brambles. The Brambles were part of their town, but it was separated by the river that ran through it. The river was a division line. On one side, families were generally happy and, for the most part, financially secure. Things were much more hectic and unstable for families on the other side. Candace was no stranger to witnessing struggles, though. She'd come from a much larger town where one would see a full spectrum of stability and economic situations simply by walking from one block to the next. The Brambles felt different to her, though. It felt like anyone who'd fallen on hard times had been plucked out of town and transplanted there. People who didn't live in that part of town avoided it. It felt like a lingering, forgotten piece of history operating with its own set of laws and standards. Candace wasn't surprised when Tommy crossed that bridge. They rode through the Brambles and up to the last house on the outskirts. It was a small, dilapidated house with chipped, white paint. The yard was overgrown and had a few rusty, dismembered cars sprinkled throughout it. Tommy pulled his motorcycle onto the gravel path that led up to the house. Pebbles spat out behind them as he zoomed past the house. The path led them to a large shed, the size of a small barn, at the edge of the backyard, next to a sprawling patch of trees. They stopped and got off the motorcycle. "I don't think this is the best time for a hike, Tommy," Candace said. "Nah," Tommy replied. He walked to the shed and unlocked the padlock holding the doors closed. When he pulled the doors open, Candace was surprised to see that the inside looked cozy and lived in. Light came through a few windows on the sides and back of the shed. Tapestries were draped on the walls, and there was a bed, a couch, and a few other pieces of furniture. Tommy flicked a switch, and several strings of lights hanging across the beams on the ceiling flicked on. Candace could see more of the space. There was a guitar hanging from the wall on the far end, and a few bookshelves that held a plethora of books, comics, magazines, and various other things Tommy had collected. The table in the middle of the room had a radio and a half-dismantled component from a motorcycle engine on it. The large circular rug on the floor was clean and soft, and the entire space was surprisingly welcoming to Candace. You live in here?" Candace asked. "Yeah," Tommy replied. "At first, I just came out here for some quiet. I made it a little hangout spot, but eventually I set up camp out here." He nodded toward the house. "I think they preferred it over me staying inside anyway." The thought of Tommy living alone in a shed made Candace sad. Not only was he orphaned by his father and abandoned by his mother, but the family he had found didn't even want him living inside with them. Tommy closed and latched the doors as they stepped in. "It's nice," Candace said. "I put a lot of time into cleaning it up and making it decent," Tommy said. "But trust me, it wasn't nice a few years ago." He walked over to one of the bookshelves and flipped through the books sitting on it. Where the hell did I put it?" he said to himself. Candace stood and took in more of the shed. Tommy had really made it his own. She noticed a few small acrylic landscape paintings hanging on the walls. Candace studied one. It was a forest in autumn. Red and orange golden leaves were blowing in the wind. A chill went up her spine as she remembered her vision from Shady's. The flames that had turned into leaves all around her. The drops of red that had consumed her. She continued to stare at the painting, and it started to feel like it was alive. The wind seemed to actually blow and catch the leaves twirling on their branches. Candace was becoming lost in the painting. She pulled it from the wall and continued to stare into it. The rustling of the trees was calming, and the sun hanging low on the horizon felt warm and welcoming. She noticed a short wooden fence that she hadn't seen upon first glance. It wound around the trees and went off into the forest. She tried to follow it into the painting to see where it went, and then she saw something move out from behind one of the trees. It was a head. It peeked out slowly from behind an oak tree. The eyes of the head emerged, and Candace stared into them. They were the glowing, white eyes of Pops. The rest of his head came out from behind the tree. His menacing smile looked abstract and surreal against the soft brushstrokes of the fluttering scene around him. Then, more glowing eyes appeared from behind more trees. Pop's friends, Wizard, Bones, and Brains, all peered out from behind trees. They each had their own twisted, demented smile. The leaves on the trees started to swirl and twist. The eyes of Pops and his friends were getting brighter. Candace wanted to scream out for Tommy, but she couldn't. Just like at the diner, she was paralyzed with fear or some kind of supernatural force wrapping its tentacles around her mind. All she could do was stare into the eyes of the men in the painting. The leaves that were falling from the trees were all smudging together. The paint was smearing and making strange, archaic symbols. The light from their eyes was reaching out to her. They shone like vibrant beacons into her soul. She was transfixed, and she couldn't look away from them. They were pulling her into the painting, sucking her into the swirls of reds and oranges. Then, it all fell away. The swirls, the light, Pops, and his friends. The painting fell face down on the floor with a thud. Tommy had smacked it out of Candace's hands before they took hold of her. He put a hand on her shoulder, and she snapped out of her hypnosis. She turned to look at him. They were in the painting, Candace said. Then they both heard a rattling on the floor. They looked down and noticed it was coming from the painting. It was face down, twitching. Tommy picked up a thick book that was lying on the table and slammed it onto the painting. The rattling stopped. Candace noticed the title of the book, Dante's Inferno. She'd helped out with a theater production of it at her old school. That's pretty intense reading for... Candace stopped, not knowing how to finish her sentence. For what? Tommy said. For an orphan kid who skips class and lives in a shed? Candace felt ashamed and embarrassed. Tommy walked back to the bookshelf he was sifting through and continued looking through it. I'm sorry, Candace said. Nah, Tommy replied with his back turned, still searching. Makes sense. I don't exactly give off the bookworm vibe. I get it. I know, Candace said, but it was wrong of me to just assume you were... I found it, Tommy yelled, cutting off her sentiment. He pulled a brown, leather-bound book from the shelf and sat at the table. He pushed aside some of the pieces from the project he was working on and pulled up a second chair for Candace. They sat. Tommy wiped some of the dust from the edges of the book. It looked very old. He opened it. The pages were thick and pulpy. As he flipped through them, Candace saw a blur of diagrams and symbols, none of which looked familiar to her. What is this? She asked. I got it from this lady named Allura, Tommy said. She used to live out here in the brambles. Tommy stopped flipping the pages. Candace looked down at the diagrams he'd stopped on. They were like the ones from the leather jackets, only more detailed, with script and symbols all around them. There were drawings along the edges of the pages as well that looked like they were plucked from an arcane cosmic vision. Souls were being sucked from their bodies. Planets aligning. Floating angelic figures on one side and dark, demonic creatures on the other. The right page was a deranged, unhinged version of the left. The wings of the creatures on the left were feathered and angelic. Those entities held planets, and swirls of energy blossomed from their chests. They had delicate, smooth, human-esque features. The creatures on the right had pointed, dragon-like wings, and their heads were fractured animal skulls. Their skin was coarse, torn, and scaled. The souls spawning from them looked tormented and lost. What is all this? Candace asked. This is some of the stuff Pops and his friends were into, Tommy replied. I get that, but what does it mean? It's like I said, Tommy began. It's all about balance. I think when Pops got burned up at Shady's, It tipped the scales and upset the natural balance of things. It wasn't their time, and it wasn't how the universe planned for them to go out. If it would have happened to anyone else, I don't know. But it happened to them, and they were connected to all this cosmic magic stuff. They entangled themselves into the elemental essence of life. The energies they were aligning themselves with are mad, I guess you could say. He pointed to one of the grotesque floating creatures on the right page. I don't think they planned to get involved with the stuff on this side, but the way they went out, the way they burned up, opened some kind of doorway for this stuff to come in. This darkness it's in their souls now or something. Tommy looked up at Candace. They're not just lost here. I think they're stuck here. And I think the longer they stay stuck, he pointed to the creatures on the right again, I think the more of this seeps through the cracks. Candace stared at the pages. Just like in the painting Tommy smacked away from her hands, the figures on the page began to wiggle. Tommy looked into her eyes, then back at the book, and then back to her eyes again. He slammed the book closed. Candace blinked and shook her head. The woman that gave you this, Candace said. Allura? Is she still around? She's dead, Tommy replied, flatly. Candace furrowed her brow. From old age, though, I think, Tommy assured her. She was like 90 when I got this book from her shop. Her shop? Candace asked. Yeah, she had a shop out here in the Brambles up until she passed away last year. She sold a lot of trippy stuff, incense crystals, that sort of thing. But she also had weird, witchy books. That's why I went in there usually. I honestly have no idea how she stayed in business or if she actually made any money. I came in there one day last year wearing this jacket, and she pulled this book off the shelf. She told me to be careful with this stuff. She explained more of it than Pops ever would. He pretty much kept me in the dark about it, always talking about it in riddles like a goddamn mystic guru or something. Allura was a little more straightforward. I told her about the mob and the fire. I was supposed to come back to her shop and talk more about it the week she died, but that didn't happen. Before she died, though, she went into some of the balance stuff. Basically, we're all connected to a network of energy. That energy can get funneled into the wrong places and turned into something dark. That's kind of the extent of what I understand. I wish she was still alive. Maybe someone else knows the things she knew, Candace said. Shop's been closed since she died, Tommy replied. Yeah, but maybe she has a kid or a sibling. Somebody, anybody. Tommy thought for a moment. She had a husband, he said. I think they carted him off to an old folks' home after she died, though. Do you think he'd know anything about this stuff? Candace asked. Tommy patted the top of the leather-bound book and replied, I have no idea, but it's about all we got, huh? They got on Tommy's motorcycle and drove off toward Evergreen Meadows retirement community. Candace was relieved to not see Pops or any of his friends poke their heads out from behind the trees or buildings they passed on their way out of the brambles. They pulled up to Evergreen Meadows, and Candace shuddered at the sight of 3 black hot rods sitting in the parking lot. They were the ones she had seen at Shady's, with the strange symbols lining their edges. The sun didn't appear to reflect off of them. They were as dark as the night itself. She felt them calling her, pulling her toward them. Come on, Tommy said, breaking her trance. She looked at him, and then turned back to look at the hot rods. In their place were 3 normal, non-menacing vehicles. A musty, stale aroma accosted their nostrils as they stepped into the lobby of Evergreen Meadows. It mixed with the smell of cleaning products meant to mask the smell of other unsavory odors. The woman behind the counter was watching the Andy Griffith Show on a tiny black and white TV. Without looking up, she tapped a sign-in sheet beside her as they approached. Tommy filled out the appropriate information, and she snatched it from the counter as he sat his pencil down. She pushed the glasses that were sitting at the edge of her nose up and read what he'd written. She turned and pulled her glasses off, letting them dangle from the chain they were attached to around her neck. You want to see Kurt? She barked. Yeah, Tommy said. That okay? She looked Candace up and down and then looked back at Tommy. He was smiling, trying to look as polite as possible. The woman slipped her glasses back on and rolled her eyes. Look, she said, I don't know what kind of day he's having. You know what I mean? He might know who you are. He might think you're his brother. He might think you're the Queen of England. I don't know. That's okay, Candace said. We won't be here long. We just wanted to pop in for a quick visit. The woman stared at them in silence for a moment. She rolled her eyes again and pointed toward a door. I'll buzz you in, she said. Kurt's the fourth door on the left. Just don't get him riled up, all right? Tommy and Candace weren't really sure what she meant by that, but they nodded politely. The door buzzed and they went through. Evergreen Meadows was anything but that. The aroma they'd experienced on their way in thickened as they entered the hallway. There was a woman in a wheelchair halfway down the hall, wheeling her chair backward into the wall, over and over. She was singing softly to herself. Her voice hiccuped with each smack her chair made into the wall. Candace jumped as she peeked into one of the rooms on the way to Kurt's. There was a man standing in the doorway, smiling at her. He was wearing a soiled polka-dot medical gown. She looked into his milky, cataract eyes. They looked like white, lifeless voids, marbles stuck into the sockets of a withering face. They continued walking toward Kurt's room, passing by unsettling sights, sounds, and smells. When they got to his door, it was closed. Tommy knocked. There was no answer. He looked at Candace and shrugged. She knocked, much louder. They heard shuffling on the other side of the door, and then it cracked open. Kurt's face appeared in the sliver of the open doorway. He looked at Tommy. Jeffy? Jeffy, is that you? Kurt asked. We're friends of Alora, Tommy replied. Oh, Alora, Kurt said, seeming to understand. How is she? Tommy didn't know what to say. He looked at Candace, who was equally lost for words. Could we come in for just a sec, Kurt? She asked. Kurt stared at her, unblinking, breathing heavily. He slammed the door, and for a moment Candace and Tommy assumed they'd lost their chance to talk to Kurt. Then the door swung open again. I'm only fooling, Jeffy, Kurt shouted. Come on in, you old son of a bitch. You and your girlfriend both. Candace blushed. They stepped into Kurt's room. It was cleaner than they'd expected. There was a bed, a desk, and a small dresser. On the far end of the dresser was a collection of stones, crystals, and herbs that looked like they had been placed with intention at some point in time. In the middle of them was a framed picture of Alora. Kurt shuffled to the small radio sitting on his desk and clicked it on. Music, similar to the music that was playing at Shady's, filled the room at a high volume. Candace felt the temperature in the room drop. Tommy delicately and slowly turned the volume of the radio down. Hey, I love this song. Just gonna turn it down a hair if you don't mind, though, so we can talk, he said with a smile. I don't like this kind of music anyway, Kurt replied. Music ain't what it used to be. Rockers and rollers and loud guitars. You know that, though, Jeffy. Nothing gets past you. How's the news business going these days? They say no news is good news, but there's always news, so I guess there's never any good news, huh? Candace couldn't help but giggle at that. Tommy smiled, sat the brown leather book he'd shown Candace on Kurt's desk, then pulled out the chair from the desk. Why don't you have a seat? He said. We got something we wanted to talk to you about, Kurt. Kurt's eyes were locked on the book. He stared at it like a deer in headlights. Tommy and Candace watched as Kurt's lips trembled. He started whispering something to himself. Tommy leaned in to try and hear what it was, but all he could make out was an unintelligible babble, or a language he couldn't understand. Tommy snapped his fingers and said, You with us, Kurt? Kurt kept mumbling to himself. Tommy snapped his fingers again and asked again, louder, Kurt, you there, buddy? Kurt stopped mumbling and looked up at Tommy. He smiled and said, That's Alora's book, Jeffy. Is she here with you? Tommy and Candace both felt slightly in over their heads. Neither of them had much experience with elderly people, especially with people in mental states like Kurt's. Tommy's intuition was telling him to just roll with whatever Kurt thought was going on. He thought it was best not to rock the boat of Kurt's mind too much. "She might pop in later," Tommy replied. He glanced at Candace, looking for approval. He needed to know if lying to Kurt was the right thing to do. She shook her head and shrugged. Tommy helped Kurt into the chair, then pushed it closer to the desk. Kurt touched the front of the book, softly. He slid his fingers down the side of it. Candace examined the shrine of Allura on the dresser. She picked up her picture. Allura was young and beautiful in it. Her hair and eyes were dark. Her smile was soft and delicate. There was strength and mystery in her. Tommy flipped the book open to the pages he'd shown Candace. "Have you seen this before?" Tommy asked. Kurt just stared, mouth agape, head down. A string of drool fell from his lip and hit the book. A breathy groan pulled itself from his lungs. "Hey, you okay, Kurt?" Tommy asked, while shaking his shoulder softly. The groan got louder. The radio on the desk got louder as well. Tommy looked at Candace. Neither of them were sure what was happening. He looked back at Kurt and jostled his shoulder again. "Kurt, buddy, you okay?" The radio jumped to an uncomfortable volume. Loud rock and roll filled the room. Tommy reached to turn it down and Kurt grabbed his wrist. He turned and looked up at him with white, glowing eyes. "Don't you touch the fucking radio, Tommy." He said it in a voice that wasn't his. A voice he and Candace both recognized. It was Pop's. Kurt's head spun around on his shoulders. He looked at Candace with burning eyes. The pitch of the song on the radio dropped and became wobbly like the music at Shady's during the fire. Pops practically screamed over it. "I'm glad you decided to be Tommy's little slut, but don't get too comfortable, we need you." "What do you want?" Candace screamed. His head spun the rest of the way around, back to Tommy. "She's fucking stupid, Tommy," Pop said with Kurt's mouth. The music got more distorted, and the lamp sitting on the nightstand by Kurt's bed started to flicker. Kurt's head started to shake violently as he grabbed the armrests of his chair. Tommy and Candace heard him groaning again. "Kurt!" Tommy yelled. Kurt threw his head back, and they watched his glowing white eyes turn dark. He stopped shaking and looked at Candace. The music softened and became a deep, static tone. Candace recognized Kurt's new eyes from the picture on the dresser. "Allura?" she asked. "They're trapped here, sweetie," Allura said with Kurt's mouth. She pulled Kurt's hands in front of him, gesturing as she spoke. "What happened to them? It wasn't right. But now, they've been here too long. Their spirits have spoiled. They want blood to repay blood, life for life." "What do they want with me?" Candace asked. "Tommy is too close to this and he's suffered already. You, though, you're pure and innocent," Allura said. "A fresh vessel. They will use you and those around you to balance the scales, to get their blood, and then they'll take you. But for now, you are the campfire that keeps them warm in the cold night. They draw strength from you, Candace." "That ain't fair," Tommy said. "That ain't who they are." Allura turned to him and said, "They aren't who they were anymore, Tommy. The darkness is consuming them. The imbalance is souring their spirits." Her voice dipped in pitch, like the music, and another string of drool fell from Kurt. His eyes flickered again, like a flashlight with dying batteries. Then they shined bright white light again, like two spotlights cutting through the night sky. The light from the lamp on the bedstand got brighter and brighter. Then the bulb popped. The light from Kurt's eyes moved back and forth as he shook his head. Another intense, loud groan escaped his chest. The spotlights landed on Candace as Kurt got up from the chair. Tommy wasn't sure what he should do. Pops was inside Kurt, moving toward Candace, but he didn't want to hurt the man. He looked at Kurt's bed and got an idea. Kurt twitched and shambled forward toward Candace. Pop's voice sprang from his mouth. "The old bitch is right. Only I won't use you like I'm using this old fart. You won't see it coming. No one will." The demented, distorted rock and roll music filled the room again. It was reaching a deafening volume. They heard someone pounding on the outside of Kurt's room, followed by a muffled voice. "Everything all right in there?" Candace saw the doorknob jiggle in the light of Pop's eyes. She looked back at him, and he was much closer. She saw Tommy behind him pulling the top blanket off Kurt's bed. The back of Candace's legs bumped into the dresser. There was nowhere left to go. The voice on the other side of the door called out again. "Hey, open this door, now!" The doorknob was shaking more violently. They heard someone slamming their weight into the door. The music had become an evil wall of noise. Tommy flung the blanket around Kurt like a net. Everything went dark as he pulled him to the floor. The door flew open. The radio was silent and the lamp on the nightstand flashed back to life. Candace turned to see an out-of-breath nurse in green scrubs with a look of bewilderment on her face. Kurt poked his head out of the blanket Tommy had wrapped around him. "I told him, Jeffy," he yelled. "Nobody takes my pecan sandies and lives to tell the tale." Tommy was sitting next to him, out of breath as well. "What is going on in here?" the nurse snapped. "Oh, they're just acting out this scene from an old play we used to do years ago at the community theater," Candace assured her. The nurse stared at her, and then looked back at the men on the floor. "Right," she said. "I think Kurt's had enough visitation for the day. It's probably almost time for his bath anyway." Kurt looked up at her like a dog begging for a treat. "Sponge bath?" he said, with a sparkle in his non-glowing blue eyes. "You two," the nurse said, looking at Candace and Tommy. She pointed to the exit. Candace jumped at the opportunity to get out of Kurt's room. "Wait," Kurt said, looking at Candace. "Alora left something for you." He pointed to the shrine on the dresser. "That necklace, the one with the dark stone," he said. "Told me it'd protect the pure flame and ward off the darkness trying to dance in its beauty." Compared to the rest of the things Kurt had said, this was oddly cryptic and out of character. Candace picked up the necklace. She turned to Kurt and said, "Thank you. It's beautiful." Tommy got up and helped Kurt to his feet. Kurt extended a hand for Tommy to shake and looked into his eyes. "Alora, she'll come visit, right, Jeffy?" Kurt asked. Tommy reached out and squeezed Kurt's shoulder. "I know she will," he said. Tommy grabbed the book, and they walked back down the hall. Candace took one last look before the door to the hallway closed and saw the man with the milky eyes watching them exit. Tommy drove across town to Candace's house. He pulled up on the curb down the block and turned his motorcycle off. It was dusk. "We didn't really get many answers from Alora," Candace said. "Only she said they want to use me because I'm pure." "Yeah, I don't know exactly what that's all about," Tommy said. "Maybe you're easier for them to get a grip on because you're, no offense, you're kind of, well, you know." Candace furrowed her brow. "Kind of what?" she asked. "Look, I've been through shit," he said. "I ain't saying you haven't, but I'm damaged goods. Maybe not the easiest person for dark spirits to take over, but you're nice. You're not damaged." He reached out and softly touched Candace's hand. Tommy pulled his hand away and looked off into the setting sun. "I gotta ask you something, and I don't want you to think I've got ulterior motives. I don't think you should be alone right now, even with your parents around. I don't know what Pops and his crew are capable of, and after today with the cafeteria and then everything with Kurt, you think your parents will believe if you told them you were staying with a girlfriend tonight?" Candace knew he was right. "We can't exactly go to the police or tell my parents we're being chased by dark spirits," she thought. "They'd think I was losing my mind, or on drugs, or 100 other things." Although she trusted Tommy, she still didn't know him well. She wanted to make it perfectly clear that their sleepover would remain PG-13. He looked at her, sensing her apprehension. "I will remain a perfect gentleman," he said. "I've got an extra couch with lots of blankets and pillows. I don't know how smart it is for you to be alone right now. I got records if you like those too. No rock tonight, though. Maybe some jazz, something light, you know." Candace smiled. She was starting to see the layers underneath Tommy's hard exterior. Beneath his shell was a kind, misunderstood soul. Someone who seemed to want friends, but had a hard time finding them. Just like her. He'd been hurt, but he wasn't bad. He'd created a barrier for himself to keep out pain, and that same barrier is what kept Pops and his gang's darkness out as well. A smile formed on the edges of Tommy's mouth. "Do you think they'll buy it? Your parents?" he asked. Candace had never given her parents a reason not to trust her. She'd almost always told the truth growing up, and she had no reason to trick them. That night, though, she figured it was an extenuating circumstance. A lie to keep her and potentially her parents safe. Tommy was what he said he'd be. A gentleman. Candace laid on his soft, blanket-covered couch, exhausted. The sickness she'd felt earlier that day was gone, but her body ached, and her mind felt fuzzy. Tommy sat a tall glass of water on the coffee table that sat in front of the couch, and took a seat on the rug. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," Candace answered. She propped her elbow on the couch and rested her head on her palm. "I'm sorry, Tommy." "Sorry?" he asked. "Why? I'm the dumbass that got us into this. I thought it'd be cool to introduce you to my dad, and he winds up being infected by some demon or something, and now he wants to use you for some dark revenge scheme? Jesus. Can't believe I just said that sentence, but no. I'm sorry I pulled you into any of this." "I know, but you just wanted me to meet your dad. It's sweet." Candace sighed and laid her head back down on the couch. "It's okay, Tommy," she said. Tommy leaned in and kissed the top of her forehead. Then he walked to the light switch. "Let's try to get some sleep, okay?" he said. "You're safe here. I'll keep an eye out, so don't sweat that." He looked around the shed, and then at Candace. She was asleep. Tommy clicked off the light and got into bed. The darkness of the shed was comforting, and soon he was asleep too. His eyes shot open when he heard the roar of a motorcycle outside the shed. It was his motorcycle. He ran to the light switch and flicked on the lights. Candace was gone. The necklace Kurt gave her was on the table. She must have taken it off before she fell asleep, Tommy thought. He grabbed it, then pushed open the doors of the shed. Candace's brown hair was flowing in the moonlight as she sped down the drive to the street. Tommy saw the design on his leather jacket flicker on her back. There wasn't time to think. He had a dirt bike behind the shed. It wasn't exactly in great shape or street legal, but it had gas. Tommy kicked down firmly, trying to start it, but nothing happened. He tapped the priming button frantically and kicked down a few more times. It sputtered on, and he raced down the path after Candace. He knew the brambles like the back of his hand. There were alleys that were shortcuts to the bridge that led to the rest of the town. He cut through them, hoping that was where Candace was headed. He pulled his dirt bike out of the last alley onto the street and fell in behind her. It was starting to rain. Tommy was surprised to watch Candace drive like she'd driven a motorcycle for years. They roared over the bridge, away from the brambles. She banked left and right at breakneck speed. Tommy stayed on her tail, but the rain was picking up, and the treads on his dirt bike's wheels were old. He fishtailed left and right as Candace sped through town. She had put some distance between them, but Tommy saw her pull over up ahead. She got off the motorcycle and started running down the sidewalk. Tommy pulled up behind her and jumped off the dirt bike as it clattered to the ground. He yelled, "Candace!" He kept running. Lightning flashed across the sky. He yelled again, "Candace, wait!" She started to walk up a set of concrete steps that led to a baby blue house. Tommy recognized the house. He'd pranked the man who lived there on more than one occasion. Some pranks were more innocent than others. It was Mr. Davis's house. Candace reached the top of the stairs and ran to the side gate. She pulled it open and slipped into the backyard. Tommy ran after her, trying not to slip on the wet concrete steps. He made it through the gate and heard glass shatter. A light on the second story of the house turned on. He ran to the back door, but Candace was already inside. Tommy pulled the bandana that was tied around his wrist off and tied it around his face. He got a glimpse of himself in the remaining glass panels of the back door. He thought he looked like a bandit from the Old West on his way to rob a bank. The door was ajar. He pushed it the rest of the way open. Candace was standing in the middle of the kitchen, soaking wet. Lightning lit up the room, and Tommy saw that she'd taken a butcher knife from the knife set on the counter. He heard Mr. Davis yell down the stairs, "Who's there? I've got a gun and I'll use it!" Candace turned to look at Tommy. Her eyes were completely white, and they started to glow with the white, burning light Kurt's had. Tommy was again in a precarious predicament. He didn't want to hurt Candace, but Pops wanted to kill Mr. Davis. "Let her go, Pops," Tommy said, pulling his own knife from the set on the counter. "You wouldn't cut her, Tommy," Pops said, calmly. Tommy thought for a moment, then threw the knife to the floor. "Fuck," he whispered. He heard Mr. Davis yell again from the top of the stairs. Tommy grabbed Candace's arms and said, "You really think this is going to work, Pops? Sure, you might kill Mr. Davis, but you might get shot or arrested or anything else. You already got your fucking claws in her. I thought you needed her, don't you?" Pops scowled with Candace's face and swung at him with the knife. Tommy ducked, and the blade narrowly missed him. He sprang up, pulled the necklace from his pocket, and managed to get it around Candace's neck. The white light in his eyes flickered, and she dropped the knife. Tommy caught her before she fell to the floor. Mr. Davis yelled from the top of the stairs again. Tommy picked her up and pushed the back door open with his elbow. A shot ricocheted off of something metal in the dark kitchen as the screen door slammed behind him. The cold rain was pummeling his face. He ran down the steps and back out onto the street. He made it to the motorcycle down the block and put Candace on it in front of him. He cradled her tightly between himself and the gas tank. Her limp body started to move a little, and then she jumped awake. Tommy looked back and saw red and blue lights, far off, down the street. "Tommy?" Candace yelled. "Hang on," he replied as he pulled the throttle back. Candace hunched down and Tommy pulled his arm around her as they pulled off into the rain. They escaped just before the approaching lights and sirens reached the house. Once they were far enough away from Mr. Davis's house, Tommy turned the motorcycle's headlight on. Candace felt sick again. Her vision blurred, and she felt Tommy's grip tighten around her. She felt like she was underwater. The raindrops that smacked into her face felt like tiny pinpricks. They made it back to Tommy's shed. Candace collapsed, getting off the motorcycle, and puked more black fluid. Tommy helped her up and got her into the shed. She fell onto his couch and took a large drink from the glass of water Tommy had sat on the table earlier. He brought her a towel and helped her clean herself up. He couldn't find the clothes she'd brought, so he began sifting through his dresser, trying to find some dry ones that might fit her. He had an old concert t-shirt he'd held onto for years. It was a lot smaller than his other shirts, but it had sentimental value. He brought it over to her, along with a pair of sweatpants, sat them in front of her, then turned around. Candace changed, then sat back on the couch. "What happened?" she asked, in a strained voice. Tommy turned back around to her. "Pops was trying to go after Mr. Davis," he said. "He was using you, Candace. I got there, and I don't know. He had control of you, like how he took Kurt." Candace looked down at her hands. They were smeared with mud, and some of the black goo she'd puked up was splattered on her fingers. She looked up at Tommy. "There has to be some way to keep him from taking control. Allura said I was a pure vessel for him, and you said it yourself, it's easier for him to take control of me." Tommy reached out and held the stone from the necklace around her neck in the palm of his hand. "This'll keep Pops from taking control. You gotta leave this thing on." Candace looked down at the stone. It looked different than it had before. There was a deep purple glow inside of it. She could feel it humming softly in her head, calming her. I don't know how she knew, but Alora knew you needed this, Tommy said. Candace felt overwhelmed again. Everything that had happened over the past few days was exhausting. She went from wanting to fit in with the popular crowd to running from demons. She knew Pops was inside of her, waiting. Tommy looked at her tired eyes and said, I'll be right back, like right back. Don't take that off. He pointed to the necklace. He left the shed for a moment and came back with a warm bowl of soapy water and a fresh towel. They washed the rest of the mud and puke off of her hands and face. Then he helped her under the covers on the couch. I know it's the last thing on your mind, but we gotta go back to school tomorrow. Candace's tired eyes got serious. What? She said. I can't. I don't. I know, Tommy said. It sucks, but if we don't, the school will call your parents, and then they'll start looking for you and probably get the cops called, and it'd be a whole thing. We gotta go. Candace took a deep breath, then exhaled. She knew he was right. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Tommy stayed awake. The next morning was a blur for both of them. Tommy reminded her to keep the necklace on. If Pops tries to jump out of a history book or anything else, or you start feeling weird at all, pull the fire alarm. That's how I'll know. We meet up here, right after each period, Tommy whispered to her as they huddled behind her open locker door. Candace shut the door and noticed the girl she'd puked on, Jen, down the hall. She was leaning against the wall, watching them. The bell rang. She rolled her eyes and walked off. Candace, Tommy said, snapping his fingers, pulling her eyes back to him. We'll figure this out, he said. Then he kissed her hand and turned to walk to class. For Candace, the thought of going to class was agonizing, but she made herself do it. She almost dozed off during the first and second periods. The teacher's words blurred together. The last thing on her mind was algebra, but she needed to keep up appearances. The sweatpants and time-worn band t-shirt she was wearing didn't help her camouflage into the background. Luckily, she had a spare zip-up sweatshirt in her locker, which helped cover some of her out-of-place wardrobe. Tommy's teachers took little notice of him in the first place. Staying off their radar was easy for him. An announcement came through the PA in his second period English class. It was Mr. Davis. Miss Anderson, the speaker crackled. Yes, she replied. Please have Thomas make his way to my office. Several of his classmates chuckled at him and taunted him. Miss Anderson raised her hand, silencing them. She nodded to the door, excusing Tommy from the classroom. Tommy walked to Mr. Davis's office, a walk he'd taken many times before. His door was closed when he got there. It was a power move. Making students knock and having them wait for him to invite them in asserted his dominance. It let them know who was in charge of the situation. The door plaque read, Assistant Principal Davis. Their actual principal was a squirming pushover. Everyone that went to the school knew that Mr. Davis was actually the one in charge behind the scenes. Tommy rolled his eyes and knocked. He heard Mr. Davis's muffled voice on the other side of the door. You may enter, Thomas. Tommy opened the door and stepped through. Close the door, Mr. Davis said. Another power move. Tommy sat in the dimly lit, stuffy room across from Mr. Davis. They both sat in silence for a moment. Mr. Davis flipped through a few papers on his desk, letting the tension hang in the air. Tommy broke the silence. What you want, Mr. D? You've interrupted my studies. Mr. Davis looked up from the papers he was shuffling. No one on my street owns a dirt bike, he said. Tommy knew what he was trying to do. Interrogation 101. He'd been in enough trouble to know that you don't give your interrogator anything to work with. That's nice, Tommy said. Do you own a dirt bike? Mr. Davis asked. Tommy leaned back in his chair and said, When I was a kid I did. I don't play with toys like that no more, though. Mr. Davis stared through his glasses at him. Tommy watched beads of sweat form on his balding head as he tapped a pen on his desk. No, I don't suppose you do, Mr. Davis continued. I imagine you've graduated to motorcycles. Probably the only graduation you'll see in your lifetime. I heard one, speeding away last night after someone broke into my back door. Interesting, Tommy replied. There were some knives on my kitchen floor. You like to play with knives, Thomas? Tommy leaned forward in his chair and said, Probably about as much as you like to play with fire, Mr. D. The bell that ended second period rang. Tommy looked back at the door and then back at Mr. Davis. We done? He asked. Mr. Davis looked down at the papers on his desk and made a gesture for Tommy to shoo, dismissing him from his office. Candace and Tommy met up at her locker to check in. No news was good news. Tommy didn't let her know about the encounter with Mr. Davis. He thought she already looked rattled enough. For Candace, third period was gym class. Given her tired eyes, sweatpants, and general sense of disarray, the gym teacher had no problem believing she was feeling sick from her period. That sort of thing made him uncomfortable to talk about, and he had no issue with her resigning to the bleachers while the other kids played dodgeball. A blur of red gym balls passed in front of her. A cacophony of sneaker squeaks filled her head. She knew Pops was inside of her, and she couldn't wait to leave school to keep figuring out how to get rid of him. She wondered if they should go back to Kurt. Allura obviously had more answers, and now that they had the necklace, maybe they could keep Pops away while they figured more things out. She wasn't sure where this was all headed, or what they were going to do. Her thoughts were cut short by a red dodgeball slamming into her face. Jen's friend, the one who had thrown the dodgeball, doubled over with laughter. Candace fell backward, catching herself before her head smacked into the polished wooden bleacher seat behind her. The necklace flew from her neck. Jen and the rest of the other girls started laughing. Candace scrambled for the necklace that had flown onto the seat behind her. She grabbed it and started to pull it over her head, but before she could, she looked up to see another dodgeball flying toward her face. Her eyes went white, and before the dodgeball made impact, it stopped. It floated in the air, a few inches from her face, spinning like a planet in orbit. Candace flicked her head forward, and the ball shot back toward Jen's friend who had thrown it. It was like a cannonball flying through the gym. When it hit the girl's face, she flew backward onto the floor. Blood poured from her nose, and a few of the other girls standing around Jen shrieked. Candace was fighting with Pops. She tried to force the necklace over her head and back onto her neck, but she couldn't. The teacher and the rest of the class were rushing to Jen's bleeding friend on the floor. Pop's voice rang out in her head. You could have this power, Candace. None of these bitches would fuck with you again. Candace pulled down harder, trying to get the necklace over her head. Either way, we're killing them, Candy. You don't have much of a choice anyway. Candace pulled down even harder. She could feel Pop struggling against her. Then she felt strength inside of her, something she didn't expect. She'd felt the presence back in Kurt's room. It was Allura. Her strength was emanating from the stone on the necklace. Together, they were able to pull the necklace back over Candace's head. Pop's voice reverberated like screams down a long hallway and eventually faded to silence in Candace's head. Some of the other students were turning to look at her. Candace ran off to the locker rooms, ashamed and embarrassed. She splashed cold water on her face and looked up into the mirror. The symbol that was branded under Pop's eye was glowing under hers. She splashed more water on her face and looked into the mirror again. It was gone. Jen appeared at the door in the mirror's reflection. Candace turned off the water quickly and started to make her way to the exit at the other end of the locker room. Jen called out to her. Hey, wait! She jogged over and put her arm across the exit, blocking the way. Candace was frozen. She felt like she had control of Pops, but she wasn't sure. I'm sorry, Jen said. Candace looked at her, surprised. Look, Jen said, those bitches can be mean, and I'm over what happened in the cafeteria. Plus, Jen rolled her eyes, reluctant to ask her question. If you're free tomorrow, some of us are coming in to work on the musical thing. I know it's Saturday, but It doesn't seem like anyone else in this stupid school knows how to do anything with props, or stages, or whatever. My offer still stands. Would you help? Candace didn't know what to say. I just... Yeah, I know, Jen said. You just broke Veronica's nose with a dodgeball. But honestly, that bitch needed knocked down a few pegs. Anyway, we're meeting at like noon, so... Candace knew she and Tommy had much more important things to do with their Saturday. She had a feeling that Jen was probably still secretly upset about the puke incident. But Candace had also been hungry to fit in for weeks. She fantasized about a moment where the door would open for her to step into her new life with new friends. She felt pulled between a dark nightmare and a vibrant fantasy. Tommy'll be furious, she thought. But she needed a respite from the chaos she'd experienced the past few days, a taste of something normal and grounded. Sure, yeah, she said. I'll be there. Tommy and Candace met again in the cafeteria during lunch. You want to do what? He asked, aggravated. Tommy, I need a break. You need your fucking head checked, Tommy interrupted. It was the first time he'd spoken to her like that. It hurt. I'm sorry. Really, I didn't get any sleep last night on account of... He pointed to the necklace. This needs to be our top priority, Candace. We don't have time to be playing dress-up with the goody-goodies. Plus, you really think those broads have good intentions? They'll chew you up and spit you out. You don't need 'em. Tommy looked into Candace's weary eyes. She looked sad. He let out a short, annoyed breath, laced his fingers through hers, and said, Fine. We'll go for like an hour, okay? Then we'll go to Kurt's. Candace made a small smile and tightened her grip on Tommy's hands. The girl who had thrown the first dodgeball at her in the gym walked by and nonchalantly smacked the back of Candace's head. Tommy jumped up from his seat and got in her face. I don't usually hit ladies, but you don't quite fit that description. She rolled her eyes and kept walking toward the table of popular girls. Tommy sat back down. Jen doesn't really like them either, Tommy, Candace said. Jen ain't no good. She's Mr. Davis's daughter, and the apple don't fall too far from the tree. Daughter, Candace said. She leaned in and lowered her voice to a whisper. Then why wasn't she at Mr. Davis's house last night? She don't live there, Tommy said, on account of Mr. Davis being a grade-A asshole who split with his wife about a decade ago. There's something else I haven't told you, too. Tommy leaned in even closer. Mr. Davis, he was Pop's brother. Candace leaned back and stared at Tommy. The realization that his uncle burned his father and friends alive and then left him without a home or family settled in. Tears welled up in Candace's eyes. No, Tommy said. Don't do that, I'm fine. Look, I grew up to be a completely normal, well-adjusted person. He smiled and wiped a tear from her cheek. And Jen, she ain't Mr. Davis. I don't like her, but she didn't do what he did. If you want to make new friends, I ain't gonna stop you. Candace smiled and wiped the tear from her other cheek. Let's just try to get rid of these old friends before you do that, all right? And thus concludes the second part of this story. It's not the ending, but it is the ending of the second part. There will be a part 3 coming out very soon. To be completely honest, I've been having a lot of fun just taking my time with this story. I don't have a lot of actual playtime when it comes to writing, so I've been using this story to play a little bit and experiment with things I wouldn't otherwise be able to. And I really hope you're enjoying that aspect of it. And I hope me kind of like toying with the theme and the tone and just really unearthing some of the elements rather than precision cutting them as I go is fun for you. As much fun as it is for you, or as much fun as it is for me as it is for you. It's certainly turning into the longest story that I've done for this show so far, but I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing. So far, I've tried out a a few different formats for these stories. Like, most of them have been one-shot episodes around an hour or an hour and a half. But I did A Chimp Named Hope. That was a two-parter, and I've also been playing around a little bit with the quick tales as well. And this podcast is relatively new, and I like experimenting and trying new things. So I'm still trying to figure out what all types of stories and what all formats I'm going to do. So this one will be my first three-parter, and if you're liking the more serial things like this, let me know. Or if you prefer the shorter, just one-shot, one-tale stories that start and end after one episode, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hit me up on Instagram or hit me up at strangewhisperspodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear what you think. With that being said, I am planning on making some more long-form stories to just sort of stretch those muscles a bit. It's a very different process making a multiple part story like this, knowing the ebbs and flows and when to like how much detail to put in each scene and when to speed the story up and slow the story down. So it's a very different process than just the one shot things, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm really enjoying just being able to take a stroll in these universes and figure out what these characters do when they're put into challenging situations. So stick around for part 3. Like I said, coming out really soon. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a bunch of ways you can do it. Leaving a rating or review on whatever podcast streaming service you're listening to this on goes a super long way. Also, just telling your friends and family about the podcast helps out a ton. You can also join my Patreon, where you get early access to episodes and exclusive content. That's at patreon.com/strangewhispers. There will also be a link in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being here and being a part of this experience with me. I'll see you for part 3, and until then, keep creating.